Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank our viewers online. You notice that I am maskless. I came with a mask, but I've been informed that Arlington has made masking optional at this point. So feel free to either keep your mask on if you have it on, or take it off if you don't want to be encumbered. Let me give you a quick update of where the Society is today. Our geothermal project, that is to bring green energy supplied heat and air conditioning to the Jason Russell House and the caretaker's cottage, is 95% done. We actually have heat in the cottage, we have heat in the Jason Russell House, and things that remain are lawn restoration and some restorative carpentry. A tool got dropped through one of the ceilings, and we've got to fix that. So those are the kinds of things that 95% done means the next 5% is the tough part. The shelving that Sarah was able to get a grant for has been installed, and the materials that were in that room have been put back on the shelf, thanks to a lot of help from a lot of volunteers and some careful oversight by Melinda and Sarah. The museum work under the state earmark is also nearing completion. The carpeting is done, the lighting is done, it looks fantastic. The next big hurdle is the back door, which needs to be redone. And we're staying in budget on all three of those projects, which is superb in my view. And I'll turn the program over now to Elaine to talk about tour guides.
Thank you, George. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Well, my name is Elaine Ropey, and I am co-chair of the tour guide committee for the Arlington Historical Society, and I co-chair along with Jean Yoder. And of course, we're very excited to be opening the Jason Russell House this year after a long wait. For anyone in our audience, including YouTube audience, that's not familiar with the Jason Russell House, it is a gem of an 18th century farmhouse with a generous lawn and a stone wall located at the corner of Mass Ave and Jason Street. And of course, it was the site of some of the worst fighting on April 19th, the first day of the revolution. And of course, we have the bullet holes to show for it. So our guide committee is looking for volunteers to lead tours through the house in the spring, summer, and fall. And the time commitment is pretty light. It's about 1 day of your choice per month through the season. And guides always serve in pairs, so no one's ever working alone. New guides get lots of training and lots of support with print resources as well as online resources, and they are mentored with an experienced guide. Training we're holding this season on Saturday, March 19th from 10 to 2:30 at the Jason Russell House and Smith Museum. The things we're looking forward to, George mentioned, the climate control, which is not only going to keep us comfortably cool in the summer. For anyone who's been in the house in the summer, you know that's a welcome development. But we also have a built-in air filtration system that will purify the air and keep the air quality safer. We have a brand new exhibit, Monotony Road to Revolution, that the public has not even seen, so we're really eager to share that with everyone. And bullet holes, more bullet holes, as a result of the bullet study that many of you might have heard about at a lecture here in November. So we're excited to share that news as well. And it wasn't long ago that I sat in this audience and heard that the guide committee was looking for new guides. So I went up to the person afterwards and said, let me investigate and check it out. And I will tell you from personal experience that it's very rewarding to share our local history with the public, and people come from all over. And it's a chance to kind of participate in bringing history to life. So I hope we'll see a lot of new faces. If you have any questions, I'll be here at the end of the lecture to answer them. We have flyers at the table, and I'll have flyers with me as well. Thank you.
Well, Elaine didn't mention that come this summer, we're going to have a beer garden every Saturday at the Jason Russell. So we had it last year just in the month of September, and it was fantastically successful. And so this year, and last year, many people were saying, can't we go in the house? Can't we have a tour? And we weren't open for that. But this year we will be. So that could even enhance being a guide, to be a part of the beer garden. So here we are redoing. As we didn't meet now for many, many months, our theme was Redux, redoing some of the stories that we weren't able to get to. And tonight's program is one of those that we were going to be doing almost 2 years ago, right, Heather? So we're thrilled to be co-sponsoring this program with the Dallin Museum. We've done this before where we shared a program. We've also done that with the Schwalm Mill. So it's nice to be doing the kind of co-sponsorship with our historical friends in Arlington. So for tonight's program, Heather Lavelle, who is the director of the Dallin Museum, is going to do the honors and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Heather Lavelle, the director and curator of the Dallin Museum. Thank you so much to Patsy and Chuck and everybody at the Arlington Historical Society for collaborating on this program with us. I'm sure many of you know that this period in history was really, here, I'll pull my mask on, was really interesting to Cyrus Dallin, and he did a number of notable works, including the Massasoit Usamequin statue in Plymouth, the Governor Bradford statue in Plymouth, and the Mayflower Compact in Provincetown, Provincetown, Massachusetts. And so we're excited for this opportunity to continue to learn about this important period in our history. I wanted to thank Ellen, our museum trustee, Ellen Ahmad, for introducing us to Christa Beranek, who is her neighbor. They're neighbors, and Christa is an archaeologist for UMass Boston's Fisk Center for Archaeological Research. She's been working for a number of years on a collaborative research program involving UMass Boston, Mayflower descendant organizations, local museums, and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And she's going to share some of the very exciting findings from a house site within the original palisaded settlement of present-day Plymouth and a nearby Wampanoag occupation area. So with that, welcome, Christa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming out, and I'm really excited to be here after I think planning this sometime in 2019. And thank you for the email reminders that this was coming up, because you know how the calendar gets when you plan something several years ago. So as people said, I work for UMass Boston for the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research. And we at UMass Boston have a specialty in doing what's called historical archaeology, projects throughout the Americas, particularly focusing on the last 500 years and particularly the Northeast, which is my specialty. And archaeology is a team-based project, so combining a lot of different specialists and a lot of different areas of expertise. And we also work collaboratively with many different kinds of organizations, descendant communities, museums, land trusts, historic houses. So I've done projects at various historic houses throughout the region and things like that. So I'm going to talk today about one of our long-term collaborative projects in Plymouth, which is directed by myself and Dr. David Landon, and one of the other project team members also lives in Arlington, Dennis Piota, who I think is a historical society, has come to a number of historical society events. He's the conservator for this project. So big team, big group, including a couple of us in Arlington here. Just to get us into the 17th century frame of reference, I wanted to show this map of what is now Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, showing the indigenous groups and the major indigenous towns that we know about from the first half of the 17th century. And this is the cultural landscape that the English colonists who settled in Plymouth entered, and the people who settled in Massachusetts Bay 10 years later in 1630. So the people settling in Plymouth were coming into the homelands of the Wampanoag. The people settling in Massachusetts Bay were coming into the homelands of the Massachusetts. That area includes Arlington today. And Plymouth in particular was established on or very close to the Wampanoag settlement of Patuxet. So we know the name of the Wampanoag settlement that immediately preceded it, and that was a village that had been decimated by a 1617 epidemic. And so the remaining residents of that village had moved to other Wampanoag settlements. And so when the colonists arrived on the Mayflower, they recognized this as a place where people had lived recently, but there wasn't anybody living there at that particular moment. And just the Wampanoag are one of Massachusetts' federally recognized tribes, and their tribal offices are just south of Plymouth in Mashpee. And we've been working with their Tribal Historic Preservation Office. We've been running this project. We started background research in 2012 and field excavation in 2013, and have done excavations every year except 2020. And we're now on to a pause. We're not excavating this coming summer. We're on to some analysis. And today I'm going to talk about both how the project developed, some of the results, but also a bit of the process of how we connect excavations and artifacts to some of the questions that we're trying to answer. How many people here have been to formerly Plymouth Plantation, now Plymouth Patuxet, the museum? Oh yes, this is Massachusetts, so this is almost everybody. So Plymouth Patuxet Museums is a really heavily researched, in-depth reconstruction of what the 17th century settlement of Plymouth might have looked like at sort of like half scale or so, with a nearby Wampanoag settlement as part of the museum, a reconstructed Wampanoag settlement. The Wampanoag settlement at the museum is on the site of an ancient Wampanoag settlement that's been there for 1,000 years. The reconstructed English village is, as you probably know, not on the original site. Unlike Jamestown and, where the original site is the tourist site, the original Plymouth is under modern downtown Plymouth. But nobody knows exactly where or what its layout was. The 17th century settlement, there was no 17th century map. So these are all reconstructions from the 20th century projecting what the layout of the 17th century town might have been onto the modern urban landscape. And so you'll note we have some written descriptions, but no maps. And the written descriptions all suggest that the 17th century settlement was a diamond shaped with one long street that ran down the middle from the fort at the top of the hill down to the harbor, with a palisade surrounding the settlement. And a palisade can be a bunch of different things, but is primarily just a sort of a substantial fence in these terms. And if you see the modern aerial photograph here, you'll notice that no matter how you draw the shape of that settlement, a lot of that area today is very urban. So this is the core of modern downtown with paved streets and modern buildings that have basements and utilities and gas lines and water lines. So our challenge was to try to find places where there were parts of the 17th century settlement preserved that had not been disturbed by all of this subsequent construction and urban living. And people have been looking for the parts of the 17th century settlement before, archaeological projects dating back to the 1970s, but so far prior to this one, without any success in downtown Plymouth. So why are we looking for downtown Plymouth? What would we do if we found it? In part, we wanted to make this sort of American mythology of the Mayflower colonists. That's a sort of a simplified, encapsulated story that's part of the American myth, and we wanted to make that story more complex and be able to answer some additional questions about that time, place, and time period. Some of those were very straightforward and material about just where on the ground is this settlement? What does it look like? What are the houses like? But we also wanted to ask questions about the interaction between the English colonists and the Wampanoag, and then ask a bunch of environmental questions about how did these Englishmen adapt to this new environment, very different climate, different plants and animals. How did they use the plants and animals that were here? How did they introduce European plants and animal species? How did they change the local environment as they did all of that? So those are sort of our major research questions. And we started excavation, as I said, in 2013, and we've looked at these 8 different areas over downtown Plymouth. And so for anybody who's been there, Plymouth Rock is right down there as sort of a landmark to anchor you, and the Mayflower, the reconstructed Mayflower docks right along here as well. So we looked at these different parcels in downtown Plymouth, and what we found is there are Wampanoag artifacts everywhere, reflecting the thousands of years of Wampanoag an indigenous settlement in the area. There's been really massive landscape change in the last 400 years, and that's not a surprise in an urban area. For anybody who's worked in an urban area, and everybody's familiar with Boston, there's been land filling and land removal and lots of moving. So lots of places in Plymouth that look natural are entirely constructed. And 17th century artifacts are very, very thin on the ground. So we looked in a lot of places and found very few 17th century artifacts. We were looking in multiple places throughout the town, but we were always concentrating, always looking also on what's called Burial Hill, formerly known as Fort Hill. This is an 1874 map that shows the site of the fort and the site of the watchtower used by the Pilgrims and the fort, and this was known as Fort Hill. And there's a historical marker, always a very good place to start, not based on any map data, but on sort of long-standing local tradition. This is the top of the hill overlooking the harbor. There are other hills, so there's a lot of debate about whether they got the right hill, but historical marker, normally a very good place to start. However, this one is in the middle of the Burial Hill Cemetery, a National Register listed historic cemetery with graves dating back to the 1680s and up to the 1950s. So we're obviously not going to look right there where the historical marker is. So instead, we started looking in this strip along School Street here, behind the backs of these buildings that are no longer standing. They all came down around 1900, in a gap between the backs of these buildings and the start of the burials. And this is what that area looks like today. Here we're sort of looking at an aerial view from School Street up the hill into the burial ground, and we're down here at the very southern end. We started our work at sort of the northern end of the strip and worked to the south, figuring that at some point we would cross from outside the settlement to inside the settlement. And it took years. We excavated for years without finding a single 17th century artifact. 2013, 14, 15. Interesting things, other artifacts, remains of the school that was along here from School Street, Wampanoag materials, all kinds. So it's not that we didn't find anything, but we definitely did not find 17th century things until we were at the very, very south end of School Street. And the first evidence that we had some 17th century material was not in what we would call an intact or in situ context. So it was 17th century artifacts, including this. This is the heel of a clay smoking pipe. It's quite small, made of white clay, and the makers sometimes stamped the heel with basically their trademark. And this RB with a dagger and a heart is from Richard Berryman in Bristol in the early 17th century. But this artifact was in soil that had been pulled down into the basements of one of these buildings as they were demolished in about 1900. So this artifact wasn't in place. It was mixed in with much later material. And archaeology really isn't just about looking for the artifacts. It's about looking for the places where we still have the artifacts in an arrangement that will tell us something about how they were used, how the space was used. So this artifact was really interesting and really significant. And because there are so few 17th century artifacts, it told us we needed to come back here, but it wasn't itself intact. So we came back in 2016 and opened up more area. And we're working right in front of this 1830s burial crypt here. looking for sort of some larger intact areas, having now moved back from the buildings, would have run right through here. So we're behind the buildings now. And this is what a preserved area looks like. And I'm going to talk through this image because right now it looks like a picture of dirt. But this is what we were very excited about this, because when you talk about looking for preserved in situ archaeological remains from the 17th century, this is what you're finding. You see you've got light colored dirt and dark colored dirt. The light colored dirt is the natural background. If you dig down through your garden topsoil here, you'll get to a lighter colored sandy underlayer, the geological subsoil. The darker areas, like here and here, are where somebody has dug a hole and brought that darker topsoil down and cut into your light underlayer. This is what archaeologists call a feature. And so these are undisturbed remains of something that happened in the 17th century. We use the artifacts to date the features. You can't date them just by looking at them. You date them by excavating them and seeing what's in them. When we outline what's here, this is what we see. This is what an archaeologist sees. We've got a number of different kinds of features. This turned out not to be a trench, but to be a deep trash pit. We've got a planting hole, some kind of very shallow trench. And then this is the same area after excavating out those features. So now we've taken away that dark soil, most of that dark soil, and you see what the shape of some of these pits. You notice this one in the back is pretty deep. That was a pretty substantial pit that somebody dug to throw stuff away in. And it was very dark, very organic, mixed in with some layers of clean sand. So somebody was throwing away organic waste of some sort. Sadly, the preservation for things like parasites is very poor, so we weren't able to tell exactly what kind. This pit was one where somebody had discarded a partially butchered calf. This was really unusual. It's mostly still articulated. Somebody's taken the skeleton and sort of like folded it in half and stuffed it in a pit. They definitely didn't get all of the meat off of that. So we were wondering, is this an animal that got killed by animals or died of disease? So after excavating the skeleton, we looked very, very closely at all the bones for butchery marks or signs of animal attack. And it does seem to be a calf that's been butchered, but not in quite the normal, what would become a normal way. And it seems to, based on the age of the animal, probably was butchered during the summer. So we think it got discarded because the meat had started to go bad before they finished disarticulating it and eating all of the meat. So all of these things put together, and this tells us that we're in an outside yard space from the 17th century. So all of these are 17th century things. And in the 17th century, people and animals lived very close together, but not that close together. So we're outside here. Trash pit, specialized disposal for the calf, a planting hole, some post holes, and lots of small artifacts through here, like you'd find trampled in a yard space. The scale there is in centimeters, and just for a sense of scale, those are straight pins. So tiny little stuff that's been thrown out after being broken and then further trampled in a yard. The top row are a number of distinctively 17th century English ceramics, English and European ceramics. This yellow and green glazed is a type called borderware, made in England. There's a very similar looking material made in the Netherlands. This is a 17th century ware called North Devon. So these are your nicer vessels, mugs and cups and nicer plates. These are your sort of coarse storage jars. And then this last is a stoneware produced almost exclusively in Germany at this time, or the area that becomes Germany. And those are usually for holding liquids, so tankards and jugs and bottles. Very, very few glass bottles at this time period, so mostly stoneware bottles. And then we have some small lead shot of various sizes, some glass beads, and some straight pins. So all of this stuff from things that have been thrown out in the yard space. When we sort of zoom out a little bit over the years since 2016, we've built up a larger picture of this area and how much of it is intact versus how much of it is disturbed. So all of this area that's shaded is either disturbed by one kind of activity or another, or in the case of the cemetery, basically unavailable for excavation. So in terms of intact area, we have this small yard space down here and a larger space up here where we have some buildings and the palisade location. So next I'm going to talk some about that area above the crypt where we have the house and the palisade. And this is all exciting because these are the first 17th century intact deposits found from the original settlement, and all of the artifacts that we have so far suggest that these date from 1620 to 1660 or so. And after the 1670s, a lot of the activity shifted towards the waterfront. The palisade was dismantled in the 1670s, and the shape of the settlement really changed. So this area was basically not reoccupied after about 1660, as far as we can tell. So just when I'm talking about finding a house at this time, in the 17th century, what we've learned primarily from archaeology is that when we're looking for a house, we're looking for something that's built with post-in-ground construction. So there's no brick or stone foundation. Instead, posts are being, the big structural posts are being put in holes dug in the ground. This is also true of Wampanoag and most native construction at the time as well. Smaller and lighter posts, more lightweight and smaller trees compared to these large posts. But that means that when you're looking for a house, what you're looking for are the stains where somebody's dug that hole and the stain where the post has decayed in place. So it's much different than looking for a brick or stone foundation. None of these buildings that are post in ground, or sometimes called earth fast, aren't generally standing still today, but it was a very common method of building throughout the 17th century up into the 18th century. And then later you might lift up your building and slip a brick or stone foundation under it as your posts started to rot out and you wanted to improve your house. But post and ground was very common. This is what our 2019 excavation area looked like behind the crypt. And because this is a very public site, we can never leave this open one year to the next, so we never get a photograph that shows us everything. Every year we open a few excavation units, record what's in them, have to fill them in, and the next year we might excavate, this strip down the middle. So we came back in 2021 and excavated this strip down here. So it's like every year we get to see some of the puzzle pieces, but never all of them at the same time. The other thing to remember about these photos is the shape of the hole in the ground is essentially arbitrary. We do it on a grid. We dig on a grid, which makes recording and mapping easier. But this is just the shape of the hole. This is not the shape of the things or the houses or the buildings. This is just the window that we're using to basically look underground to see the houses of the buildings. Okay. And this is what that area looks like when we take all the people out of it. And now, since you all know what you're looking at, you'll notice that there's some darker areas and some lighter areas and some stones there and some deeper areas. And I'll get into what all of those areas represent. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what are all the people in that other photograph doing? Because I think everybody knows that archaeologists excavate and they look for artifacts. But what else are they doing? So there are definitely people who are excavating, and this is all by hand, and mostly with a little mason's trowel, scrape, 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 scrape. All the dirt comes out and goes into buckets and runs through these screens. So we find the artifacts, including the small ones, like the pins and the glass beads. But then there are a lot of other people out here doing other equally fundamental parts. There are people here with the receiving end of a surveying total station, because we really need to know exactly where all of these points are, because we come back year to year and reopen the same holes in the ground or open the next hole over. And so accurate mapping is very important. We also want other people to be able to follow up on our work in like 20 or 30 years. So all of these are recorded in a state plane grid, the Massachusetts state plane grid system. Somebody else could come back and find exactly where we dug. So the surveying is very important. There are lots of people writing and drawing, taking notes and doing measured drawings. Archaeology is essentially destructive. Once you've dug it up, it isn't there anymore. So the documentation is extremely important. And then because this is a public site, also, people walk up and want to know what's going on. So we do spend a lot of time doing public interpretation, explaining the process and the results to people who come by. So a lot of stuff going on. I have a couple more shots that show what that work looks like. These are working in our very clearly flagged out survey units, and we take the dirt off very levelly, nice and flat, because that's the only way you're going to see these soil stains in the ground, the outlines of different colored soil. The only way you see that is if you take the dirt off nice and flat and clean to be able to see these shapes. So when people say, oh, well, I found these artifacts, it's a very different process than knowing, oh, I found this post hole. It's a very different kind of looking process. The other reason we excavate so carefully is that we want to remove one soil layer at a time. So she's removing just the dark soil in this little post hole. They've very carefully removed all of the dirt that's sitting on top of these cobbles to see if that's a floor or a surface or something that's there intentionally. Lots of time drawing and note-taking and measuring and photographing. And then also, not everything that we're looking for is an artifact. We also want to answer these environmental questions. So we bring back a lot of little bags of soil and some big bags of soil to do various specialized analyses to answer these environmental questions, to look for charred wood and seeds, to answer questions about what people were eating or the kinds of fuel woods that they were burning. We might look for insect remains or parasites or pollen, which will tell you about the local and regional environments. Pollen preserves really, really well, it turns out. It's why it's so irritating to us. It's an incredibly robust material. So pollen is very well preserved in these soils. Phytoliths are another plant remain, sort of plants. I'm not a plant remain specialist, but they're a silicified sort of plant cell part. So this is a very excited graduate student who's working on this for her PhD dissertation at another university, and who's been collecting samples from these excavations to look at environmental change over time. So she has some samples from prior to colonization and from after colonization to look at large-scale environmental changes. And then outreach, public interpretation and outreach to people who walk up, to organized groups who come, because that's another part of working collaboratively, is letting people know, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What have we found out? And then finally, there's the lab work. All of those artifacts that we've screened out of the soil need to be cleaned and sorted and identified and cataloged. And that takes a lot of time. And then what takes even more time is the figuring out what it all means. Getting together, sitting down with all of that paperwork and the artifact catalogs and trying to answer the questions of like, okay, we've dug this stuff up. What does it mean? And how do we convey that data to other people? The rule of thumb that people say is that for every day a person spends in the field, they generate 3 to 5 person days of follow-up lab work and analysis. So if we run a 20-person field school for 5 weeks, that's 20 people times 25 days times 3 to 5 days each of lab work. That's now up to multiple years of follow-up work, which is why we're not digging this summer, because after 8 seasons, we have some catching up and synthesis to do. So a huge amount of work that happens sort of out of the public eye and after all of the excavation is done. Okay, so back to what does it all mean? What are we looking at here? This is our interpretation of what we are seeing here. We have very deep deposits down in here that represent the floor of a building that was cut way down into the hillside. And we don't think this is a basement. We think this is actually the living floor is cut down into the hillside. Adjacent to it and abutting it is not really a separate building, but an additional part that's at a different level. Its floor is much more shallow. And then right behind the wall of this building is this dark line that we've interpreted as the palisade surrounding the settlement. And then outside that, we have a whole complex activity area. We've got pits and cobbled areas and scatters of artifacts that are very different in character to what we see inside the palisade. So I'm going to look at the buildings a little bit first. They're long and narrow. As I said, the floor is very deep. So the people who are working down in that trench, these are tree roots from this lovely copper beech that the town would like us not to kill. So we're working around and now below the tree roots. So there are full-size people down there under the tree roots at the level of the floor of the building. These people are also at the bottom of their excavation unit. One of the questions that people always ask is, well, how deep do you dig? And the smart aleck response is, well, till you get to the bottom. But the bottom is really different depending on what's happened in some place. Here, they're at the bottom. They're at the bottom of the cultural soil layers at the top of that transition to the natural glacial subsoil. They're at the bottom of a place where people have cut down deeply into the surrounding landscape to build something. And they're not very far apart. So how deep we dig, especially in an urban area, really, really varies. This is what we're seeing down there under the tree roots. You notice there's this really dark buried layer down there. It's not normal that you dig down and down and down and find something dark. When you do, you know that you found something cultural. And this is a really charcoal-rich floor. And when we came back in 2021 and dug out the adjacent unit right through that wall there, we found what's probably the hearth. So this building didn't have a constructed fireplace or chimney. It just had a hearth on the ground surrounded with small stones, probably just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. And the floor surface all around this was covered in little bits of charcoal. Above that charcoal was a bunch of material that was made mostly of daub that we think has just sort of slumped and melted into the building after the building was abandoned. And really sort of sealed all of this floor in place. And then sitting on the floor under that daub were tumbles of artifacts, really as if you could imagine they'd fallen off a shelf and you could see some of them still at this odd angle and it really in a pile just on the floor. So we really get an impression of a building that was abandoned with stuff still in it that people maybe intended to come back to, but didn't, and over time just fell in on itself. And these are some of those artifacts taken back and sort of put back together in the lab. We have a German stoneware gorget, sort of a large globular drinking vessel. This is one of those green glazed, either English or Dutch pots or pipkins. This is what's called tin glazed, very fancy, large plate or charger made in things like that were made in Portugal and the Netherlands, later in England. And then some very utilitarian, this is a redware milk pan, but all of these would have been made in Europe and imported. And we have some evidence also of what this building looked like. Although it was a building with no chimney and a dirt floor, they had glass windows. We have pieces of diamond-shaped glass and the lead came that would have held them in place. And bunches of nails from the floor level for holding the wooden structural elements together. So domestic assemblage, things from a household, but not a lot of things, not a huge number of things. And this is an artistic reconstruction of what we think that building would have looked like, sort of with the slope falling away and the back walls of the building cut into the hillside. This is really a building that uses the topography and is kind of expedient. So if you imagine that you have this settlement, which you've decided to put on this fairly steep hill, and this is the building furthest up on the slope, on the steepest part of the slope, you have two choices. You could spend a lot of time leveling a piece of ground to build on, or you could cut into the hillside and sort of use the hillside as part of your building. So we think this is very early, very expedient. It's not a typical building method at all. And then we have what's a part that seems to be added later here, which we'd call the second structure that's attached to it. And then right behind it, we have the palisade. And that's what you see here, this dark soil stain lined with rocks, not hugely substantial, so much more a sort of a symbolic divider of space than a functional defensive divider of space. You can see palisades that are more substantial, that are built with big earthen, there'll be an earthen mound and then there'll be a fence on top of that. This is not that. This is very lightly constructed, but it really, really separates activity areas, because right outside this, we have a large area where the activity and the artifact assemblage looks really different. We have a lot of contemporary, what seems like English and native artifacts being deposited in the same soil layer, and the native artifacts predominate. The Wampanoag artifacts are much more numerous and will have an occasional fragment of a smoking pipe or piece of English pottery, or even a piece of like English ballast flint that's come over as ballast in one of the ships, but then has been worked some here. But we have many, many more flakes of local stone that were chipped to make stone tools. So we really see different activity areas out here of somebody sitting and sharpening stone tools, not doing the primary processing of not the making the tool from a cobble, but the sharpening, the little flakes chipped off. We have pieces of Wampanoag ceramic. This is how I scare the students at the beginning of the semester. I show them one of those and be like, this is what you are trying to find in your screen of artifacts covered with dirt. Because they're tiny and they are brown. So this outside the settlement has a real sense that this is an area where Wampanoag people are coming to, I'll back up a slide here, gathering outside the palisade, maybe at the location of a gate, there for trade, to exchange information, to exchange labor, but a lot of people coming routinely over a long period of time, it seems, in a very bustling outside of settlement. And we don't see this same scatter of tool making and that taking place on the inside of the palisade. So this is a distinctive set of activities we see outside the palisade. What we do see inside the palisade, particularly in some of these yard features, is a mixture of native ceramics and European ceramics, and native lithics and European lithics inside the palisade in some of these early features, suggesting that, the ceramics particularly are a 50-50 mix of English and native in that trash pit in the yard, suggesting that the English households were using locally made Wampanoag pottery. And that's not a revolutionary idea at all once you've thought of it. But if you think about the best researched recreation of this period, the village at Plymouth Plantation, there are no native pots in those houses, and they've thought very seriously about how to furnish those houses, and yet somehow had never thought, well, of course, this isolated group of 50 to 100 colonists out here with only very incremental ability to be resupplied from England, they're going to have native-made pots. They're going to be reliant on being supplied by some of these goods from their Wampanoag neighbors. So it seems that particularly in the earliest households, a lot of the replacement pottery must have been locally made, native-made ceramics. We don't have a recreation of an English potting system here early in the 17th century. That comes in much later. So this is one of the ways that we're working with Plymouth Plantation, the museum, to change and update their exhibits. So they're now thinking differently about how they furnish some of these some of these English households. We also have a really interesting collection of artifacts from inside this building that speak to trade. This is a lead bale seal from cloth. This is a little bit larger than a quarter, just to give you a sense of scale. And cloth is one of the major trade items that's coming into the colonies. And of course, it's not preserved archaeologically, but the lead seals that come in on the bales of cloth are. And we have two of them from this house. And that really suggests that this is a place where large amounts of cloth were being imported. And we don't know exactly, we can't say for sure whether that's being imported to then be redistributed to the English colonists or for trade to the Wampanoag. But cloth was one of the major European cloth was one of the major products that the Wampanoag and other native groups were interested in acquiring. And it's a really one that's like missing from the archaeological record and from a lot of the material culture record because it doesn't preserve as well. So this speaks to materials coming into this household. And this is a bale seal that dates to the reign of Charles I, so right in our time period, up to pre-1660. We also have a selection in the household of other items that speak to trade. These are, again, are glass beads. These are little tiny glass beads, as are these, and these are shell beads. There's no tradition of the English colonists using beads on their clothing or their apparel at this time period, so those are understood as goods that are coming in exclusively for trade and to be traded. And the shell beads are likely Wampanoag made and speak to the presence of a Wampanoag person probably in that household who lost them at some point. So these are items that are very definitively part of trade and interaction. And then we also have evidence of coin-based trade here. Coinage was very, very scarce in the early 17th century, but we have two of these English patent farthings. These are about the size of your thumbnail and like paper thin by this point. And again, date from the first half of the 17th century and speak to the presence of somebody here who is probably engaging with European merchants and traders from this household. And then even more specialized, we have a coin weight. And I'm showing it in somebody's hand just to give you a sense of, again, the size of this artifact. And then those are blow-ups of it. And this has a hand on one side, which is the symbol of the city of Antwerp, and the initials of the maker, Hans Fonck. What coin weights were for, because coinage was so scarce, there was a big worry about it being counterfeited and about people clipping it or cutting it up or trimming the edges off of silver coins to melt down into other coins. So coin weights were made so that you could check the weight of a coin that you were given to see if it was legit. Does it weigh enough? Is it not counterfeit? Is it all there? And these were really specialized. They came in sets. They would have been owned by merchants, not widely distributed. So this is an amazingly specialized artifact that we found this last summer on the floor of this house, this deeply buried floor. So somebody living in this dirt-floored, mud-walled house was engaging in intercolonial trade, probably for the colony. And that's sort of where we are in the interpretation at this point. This is the first structure anybody's been able to locate from inside the 17th century settlement, dates till 1620 to 1660, and it's a building with a mixture of functions. Somebody was definitely living here. This was not just a storehouse, but the person living here was definitely engaging in trade, probably both locally and intercolonially. So in some ways, this might have been sort of a company building or a corporate building, and a really specialized trade assemblage in it. Really significant evidence of interaction with the Wampanoag, both for goods used inside the house and in terms of the activity that was taking place outside and around it. And this is helping us to sort of add a lot of texture and detail to our understanding of the early 17th century. As I said, this is a big team-based project, and a lot of these topics that I'm talking about are the subject of ongoing research by students and colleagues and ourselves. So we're at the point where we're stopping digging up new data and like synthesizing the data we have. So hopefully we'll come to a lot more conclusions and sort of presentations of this over the next couple of years. So thank you very much. And at this point, I'm happy to do questions if people would like to ask questions. Yes.
So I'm wondering, were you surprised by the close proximity of the building or buildings? Very close.
Yeah, they are really close, and that's one of the reasons we think that the palisade isn't primarily defensive. It's much more defining an English cultural space as opposed to the outside world. much more sort of cultural than functional in many ways. And it may also be that the house was built integral somehow with the palisade, that they were sort of doing double duty with that construction, that it somehow was part of supporting the roof structure or something like that. It was being like built up against the wall, which is a way a lot of early forts and trading posts were built, but not how we'd understood early Plymouth to date. So, yeah.
So you found the palisade.
We did.
First time anyone found it.
Yes.
Well, that's what we cheered.
And we were very excited about it. So,
I have this mental image of memory 50 years back. The palisade looked like trees that had been lopped of all their branches and sharpened with the spikes and put into this mighty row. That's not what you described.
no, it is probably trees that have had their branches taken off, but small trees, like young ones, not cut down into boards, but small trees put in, yay far apart or so within some sort of horizontal supporting members. But no, not gigantic. You got to remember that this palisade was up by 1627 or so, when labor was very short. People were really struggling and they were trying to get something constructed. So yes, not huge.
And the last question I have is there any documentary or cultural evidence that the first settlement had a foreign trade office?
So the settlement was was sort of backed by a company in England who was financing it. And in order to pay them back, they were supposed to be sending back furs and timber and fish and things in exchange, and then they would get resupplied with other kinds of things. So they had to have some kind of arrangement for trade. For a while, that whole arrangement was corporate among the whole settlement, and then in 1627 they decided this sort of corporate arrangement wasn't working, and they split up, and a group of 7 people took on the entire sort of colonial debt and became more centrally responsible for the trade. But that's sort of as far as we've gotten. We know that Isaac Allerton and Miles Standish were both sort of heavily involved in this, as were the colonial governors, Bradford. Our best guess based on location is that this might have been Miles Standish's house because it was very close to the fort at the top, but it could also have been Allerton's, and we're never going to be able to, I think, parse that out. Allerton was probably one of the most heavily involved in the trade network, so all of the trade artifacts might lean it more heavily towards Allerton. So, yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the pottery that you found from the
A little bit. We've only found very, very small pieces. And it's in the tradition of, there's a long tradition going back almost 1,000 years of locally made pottery that gradually gets thinner and thinner and thinner over time. So this is a low-fired earthenware made from local clay, but very well made by this point. It was all coil made and then smoothed, and then a lot of it, and you could see some of these have sort of punk date decoration put in on the outside. So little, this is intentional decoration, little dentate decoration in there, with shell mixed in as the temper. So these would have been large conical vessels or round-bottomed vessels made to be balanced on rocks and used for cooking over an open fire or for storage. But we know that mostly about the shape from other examples that have survived, not from these are our biggest pieces. So.